Dear family and friends, with no exaggeration, I want to start by saying that 2019 has been very hard in this ongoing journey. It's only been 5 years since I opted to surrender to God and His Word, the Bible, but in doing so, I've observed the difficulty of life increasing exponentially with each passing year. Thus far, I've been left to conclude that this dynamic will continue. In other words, life will get harder. However, due to God's guidance, His overall sovereignty, and the continued transformation of my mind that He orchestrates, the way I respond to the challenges of life is changing. With this respect, it will mean the difficulty of life won't be as described above, getting harder with each passing year, but instead will depend on my maturity as a follower of Christ and my mindset's response to each individual situation. This ongoing relationship with God grants me a steadfast grounding I've never known before, that makes perfect philosophical, theological, psychological, and most significantly, spiritual sense. I could try to elaborate on this, but my description would likely fall short. Instead, what I often tell people is like the Matrix, one has to see or experience God for themselves, taking a step of faith to see if Jesus really is true to the Bible's word. From a carnal, tangible, worldly perspective, 2019 has perhaps been one of the hardest years of my life, an extremely close second to the year of 2013, where I faced much more than I ever anticipated in this lifetime. From a spiritual perspective, it's been one of the most fruitful, and being clear, it's this latter perception that really holds significance going forward. This letter is simply to relay some of the God-inspired thoughts that my mind has engaged during the daily tasks at the latter part of 2019. I've often told my pre-believer friends about the renewal of my mind and how I'm still amazed at this miraculous, active repentance in my thought process, that a person can actually change. Not merely adapt, but truly change from a root, resulting in change in desires and intentions. Now, everything I observe or contemplate goes through a filter with God. What emerges are some powerfully new and unique ideas that my old self would never have thought about. As I've said in previous letters this year, 2019 opened with a strange revelation. I knew this year was going to be hard for Christians, and I also felt like we were really in end times, an often overused term that I've tended to ignore. This revelation was clarified for me by a teacher who said to me, "What you've experienced is a change in your mindset, not necessarily that 2019 is any different from previous years." This change in my mindset can be explained in the sense that my perceptions were more outward-looking than inward-looking. I was seeing other people's problems and issues more than my own. This was intensified when I was led to do daily walks of 10,000 steps around London. What I saw was astonishing and slightly disheartening. London appeared to be falling apart, and it felt like my clarity of vision was sharpened to the pain and suffering around. During the Christmas fair at my church this year, the Game Connect 4 Giant Size provided me a great parallel for what I mean in this change in perspective, which continues to grow every day. Instead of focus on the self and all the things that come with that focus, my mind is growing a sincere conscience for others around me. What we often don't realize is that in the pursuit of self-improvement or whatever self-oriented activity we're doing with good intentions, our objectivity on situations is clouded or sometimes completely blinded. To exhibit this, when playing the Game Connect 4, I noticed that being involved in the game itself as one of the players limited my perception. I had to be extra vigilant because a simple slip-up in the game and the opponent would claim 4 spaces in unison, leaving me wondering, how did I miss that? But when one is observing the game, in other words not a player, one can see all the moves available as the players proceed. This observation reminded me of how God removes self or ego out of the equation for us, so we're able to be objective about situations, being cheerful givers, counting others more important than ourselves, loving our neighbours as we love ourselves, and even going as far as to be able to love our enemies. With self in the mix, our perspective is limited like a Connect 4 player, but with self removed, we can see all the available positions and therefore work more compassionately with others. I've recently thrown myself into an abundance of books by Timothy Keller, Philip Yancey, and a couple more from my favourite 19th century teacher Andrew Murray on the subject of hurt, pain, and suffering. Although each book has left me with a deeper understanding of the Bible's scriptures, kingdom principles, and that thing we dislike called pain, No other book has been so deeply convicting as George Mueller's autobiography. George Mueller is a name renowned because of his experiment with God, though I'm probably doing him and God a great disservice by calling his faith an experiment. For the skeptics, including myself, a more universal and understandable word to describe George's life is that he took a risk. The reason I call it risk is, much to my sad confession, because of my lack of trust for specific characteristics of God that George believes without any doubt. This is not to say I'm some kind of mixed up believer, but this is merely to expose that I'm still on a journey with God, learning about his character. My greatest difficulty since I've come to know God, which is rooted in childhood disappointment, is believing the concept that God's a giver of good things, an answer to heart's desires, a rewarder of faith, and a kind benefactor. But George believes this and not only confesses it with his mouth, but reveals the belief of his heart, his deep convictions, by his action of giving over his entire life in a way rarely seen today. What really grabbed me was the more poignant questions of Mr. Mueller's journal that challenged my heart, like, do you make it your business to seek first the kingdom and all his righteousness? I can't ignore the impact and inspiration that Mueller brings through his autobiographical account that journals his day-to-day struggles and successes. This in his endeavour to rely on God alone for all his provision with the vision he'd been given to establish orphanages. It's a remarkable and encouraging tale, and it would be irresponsible as well as unwise to read the book as just another of the millions of testimonies of God's grace. This man truly lived the surrendered life, and the fruits of God's faith and grace are apparent in George's life. It's not that I intend to be another George Mueller, but I recognize that the convictions he expresses in this autobiography mirror many of the heartfelt changes God has granted me. Some of these convictions would be deeply unpopular in Christian circles, as they speak of a faith that would likely be classified as radical when in fact it's simply faith as described by Jesus himself. I quote, "He said to them, 'Because of your little faith, for truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you.'" Mr. Mueller makes it very clear that there is nothing special or unique about him. The simplicity is that he followed God's calling to the letter with faith and grace, a profound challenge for any who call themselves followers of Christ. Reworded for practical application in my life, God left me with two leadings at the final quarter of this year. Number 1, stop wrestling for a blessing, flow with the Spirit, and number 2, meet with friends and family one-on-one more often. I couldn't help but notice that these two leadings fall in line with Jesus' two commands about loving God and loving your neighbour. The former leading is related to my mindset. I'm fully aware of the folly in performing for God. Thankfully, all the positions I've been led to in the church have all come from God and not my own choosing or volition. My wrestling for a blessing in the past has been a much more passive mental process. I can never understand why my time with God has been non-stop trials, tribulation, and furnace fire. Now I'm going to rest in His word and promise of safety, so that when tough times arise, I will resist the urge to ask, why me, and sincerely rejoice in the opportunity that hardship brings, which is a chance to be refined and emerge more Christ-like, at peace, joyful, humble, willing to serve, willing to give. The second leading to me seems the only way to combat the apathy and tyrannical force of busyness that has swept London. One must work with an intentional nature about relationships and prioritize building real friendships. This leading is what I'm moving with as we transcend into 2020.